There is a moment that happens in almost every relationship, a quiet, almost imperceptible shift that most men do not notice until it is too late. You are doing everything right. You show up on time. You remember the small details. You try so hard to be exactly what she needs. And somehow, without a single dramatic betrayal, you feel her pull away inch by inch until one day the distance between you is too wide to cross. If you have ever felt that happen to you, you already know it does not arrive as a single event. It arrives as a feeling, a subtle shift in her voice, a pause before she answers, a warmth that used to be automatic and now has to be requested. The strangest part is that most men spend months trying to fix this with the wrong tools. They try harder. They give more. They apologize for things they never did wrong. They shrink themselves smaller and smaller, hoping that if they just become agreeable enough, safe enough, easy enough, she will come back to the way she looked at him in the beginning. It never works. And by the end of this, you will understand exactly why. There is a question hiding underneath almost every relationship problem a man will ever face. And almost nobody asks it directly. The question is not, how do I get her to want me? The question is, why did my sense of who I am start depending on whether she wants me? Because once you trace every insecure text message, every jealous thought, every moment you agreed with something you did not believe just to keep the peace, you find the same root every single time. Somewhere along the way, your value stopped living inside you and started living inside her opinion of you. This is not a script about seduction. This is not a list of lines to say or tricks to perform. Those things are a costume, and costumes fall apart the moment real pressure is applied. What we are going to build today is something underneath the costume. Something that does not flinch when she goes quiet for a day. Something that does not collapse when another man's name comes up in conversation. Something that stays standing during an argument instead of either exploding or folding. We are going to talk about where real confidence actually comes from and why almost everything you have been taught about it is backwards. To understand this properly, I want to borrow an idea from a man who spent his entire life studying power. Not romantic power, political power. His name was Niccolo Machiavelli. And centuries ago, he wrote about what separates a ruler who survives from a ruler who gets overthrown the moment his luck runs out. His argument was simple and brutal. A ruler who depends on borrowed strength, soldiers he does not control, alliances he did not earn, wealth he inherited rather than built, is always one bad season away from losing everything. But a ruler whose power comes from his own resources, his own decisions, his own competence, can absorb a crisis and still be standing afterward. Machiavelli called the borrowed version a fragile kind of authority propped up by circumstances outside your control. He called the earned version something closer to real strength because it does not evaporate the instant fortune turns against you. Now take that entire idea and drop it into a relationship. Most men are ruling their own sense of self-worth, the way a fragile prince rules a kingdom he did not build. His confidence is propped up by things he does not actually control. Her mood, her attention, whether she texted back quickly, whether she laughed at his joke, whether she chose him over the version of himself he is comparing to some man on her social media. All of that is borrowed territory. None of it belongs to him. And a kingdom built on borrowed land collapses the second the person who lent it decides to take it back. You can see this pattern the instant a man's mood shifts entirely because a message took 4 hours instead of 40 minutes to arrive. You can see it when a perfectly calm, funny, interesting man turns into someone anxious and hard to be around the second his partner mentions spending time with a male friend. You can see it in the man who agrees with everything, who has no real opinions of his own left in the room, who has quietly erased his own preferences one by one because disagreement felt too risky. None of these are separate problems. They are all symptoms of the same disease. His identity is being rented from someone else, and rent can be raised, or the lease can be cancelled at any moment. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who understood human nature better than most, wrote that we should not seek to have events happen as we wish, but to wish them to happen as they do happen. When you base your self-worth on whether she chooses you, you are doing the opposite. You are demanding that events conform to your wishes rather than accepting what is actually within your control. Here is the uncomfortable part. Women feel this before they can even explain it. They cannot always articulate what is happening. But on some instinctive, almost animal level, they sense when a man's entire emotional weather system depends on their behavior. And instead of feeling flattered by it, most of them start to feel burdened by it. Because now they are not just dating a partner, they are managing a mood. Every word has to be chosen carefully. Every plan has to be explained twice. Every independent decision has to be softened because the man on the other end is one disappointment away from an emotional storm. That is exhausting. Exhausting is not attractive. Exhausting is the opposite of magnetic. The Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius wrote that you have power over your mind, not outside events. When you let her mood dictate your emotional state, you have handed over that power. You have made her the architect of your peace, and she did not ask for that job. So if borrowed confidence is fragile, what does earned confidence actually look like? This is where most advice online gets it completely wrong because it tries to shortcut the process. It tells men to fake it, to walk a certain way, to talk a certain way, to project an image of a man who has already arrived without ever doing the internal work that makes that image true. That approach is exactly like a small country pretending to have a massive army. It might work for a photograph. It will not survive an actual invasion. The moment life applies real pressure, a rejection, a betrayal, a financial setback, a public embarrassment, the performance cracks and what is left underneath is exposed. Real earned confidence rests on three foundations, and none of them have anything to do with a woman. The first is competence that you actually built with your own hands. Not competence you were told you have. Not competence you assume you have because you watched enough videos about it. Competence you tested against reality and proved to yourself over and over in situations where failure was genuinely possible. This could be a skill at work that took years to sharpen. It could be a physical discipline you stuck with long after the motivation disappeared. It could be a difficult conversation you learned how to navigate without falling apart or attacking the other person. The specific skill matters less than the process of watching yourself become capable of something you were not capable of before. Because once you have lived through that transformation a few times in a few different areas of your life, you start to trust a very specific thing about yourself. Not that you are perfect, not that you will never fail, but that when you fail, you know how to work your way back. That trust is worth more than any compliment a partner could ever give you. Because a compliment can be withdrawn and this cannot. The second foundation is resilience that has actually been tested. This is different from competence. Competence is about what you can build. Resilience is about what you can survive. Have you gone through a real loss and kept functioning? Have you had a plan collapse and rebuilt a new one instead of collapsing with it? Have you sat in an uncomfortable conversation, felt the urge to either attack or retreat, and chosen neither, staying present instead? Every time you prove to yourself that discomfort will not destroy you, the list of things that can genuinely threaten your stability gets shorter. And here is the part that matters for relationships specifically. A man who has already survived real hardship does not experience a woman's bad mood or a temporary distance or an argument as a catastrophe. He has calibration. He knows what an actual crisis feels like, and a delayed text message is not it. That calibration alone removes 90% of the anxious behavior that damages relationships from the inside. The philosopher Seneca, who endured political exile and personal tragedy, wrote that fire is the test of gold, adversity, of strong men. When you have been tested by fire and survived, the small flames of daily uncertainty no longer frighten you. The third foundation is a philosophical base, and this is the one almost nobody builds deliberately. It means having clarity about what you value, what kind of life you are trying to construct, and why. It means having answers, even rough ones, to questions like, what does a good day actually look like for me? What am I willing to compromise on, and what am I not? What do I want to be able to say about how I lived when I look back on this decade? Most men never sit down and actually answer these questions. They drift, reacting to whatever emotion or event or person is directly in front of them, borrowing their sense of direction from whoever seems most confident in the room. A man without a philosophical foundation is like a ship without a rudder. He will still move, but the current decides where he ends up, not him. And a woman can feel the difference between a man who is steering his own life and a man who is simply being carried by it. One of those men is interesting to be around because being near him feels like being near momentum. The other is draining because being near him feels like being handed the wheel of a ship neither of you actually wants to steer. When these three foundations are actually in place, something changes that is almost impossible to fake. The relationship stops being the entire structure of a man's identity and becomes one wing of a larger building. He still deeply wants connection. He still deeply cares about the person he loves. But if that wing were to collapse, the rest of the building would remain standing. That single fact changes everything about how he shows up. He is not auditioning for his own worth in every interaction. He already has it. The relationship becomes an addition to an already whole life, rather than the only source of oxygen keeping that life alive. Machiavelli made a distinction between what he called virtù, a man's own skill, discipline, and capacity to act, and what he called fortuna, blind circumstance, luck, the parts of life nobody controls. His argument was not that fortune does not matter. Fortune matters enormously. Bad timing, bad luck, forces completely outside your control shape outcomes constantly. His argument was that a man who has built real virtù can absorb a swing of bad fortune and recover, while a man who has none is completely at its mercy. Translate that into a relationship, and the implication becomes almost uncomfortable in its clarity. You cannot control whether she is attracted to you today the way she was attracted to you a year ago. You cannot control her mood, her past, her fears, the timing of her life, or the 1,000 invisible variables that shape whether two people stay compatible. That is fortune. What you can control is whether you spent that same year becoming someone with more capability, more clarity, and more depth than the man she met at the beginning. That is virtù. Men who obsess over controlling the uncontrollable, tracking her mood like a stock price, trying to manage every variable in her mind, are fighting a battle that was never winnable in the first place. Men who instead pour that same energy into building the parts of themselves that are actually within their control end up, almost as a side effect, becoming the kind of partner fortune tends to favor anyway. Here is where the truth gets uncomfortable, because most men do not want to hear this next part. If your sense of worth collapses the instant she pulls away, that was never really about her. It was a pre-existing fracture that she simply happened to reveal. Relationships do not create insecurity out of nothing. They apply pressure to structures that were already unstable. The same way a storm does not create a weak foundation, it just exposes one that was already there. This means the man who blames a woman for making him insecure is usually misreading the situation entirely. She did not install the wiring. She just turned on the light and it flickered. The philosopher Epictetus wrote that it is not events that disturb people, but their judgments concerning them. The event is that she pulled away. The judgment is that this means you are not enough. And that judgment, not the event itself, is what causes your suffering. This also explains a pattern that confuses a lot of men deeply. Sometimes a man does everything the self-help content tells him to do. He goes to the gym. He gets a better job. He buys nicer clothes. He becomes objectively more successful by almost every visible measurement. And yet, he still feels exactly as insecure inside a relationship as he did before any of it. Why does that happen? Because those changes address the outside of the fortress while leaving the internal wiring completely untouched. A nicer car does not answer the question of whether you believe you are enough without it. A better job does not answer the question of what happens to your identity if she leaves anyway. These external upgrades can absolutely be part of building real competence, but only if they come from genuine internal growth rather than an attempt to purchase self-worth from the outside in. The gym membership that comes from disciplined self-respect builds something real. The gym membership that comes from desperately hoping a six-pack will finally make you feel worthy builds a slightly more attractive version of the exact same insecurity. There is also a quieter trap hiding in the digital world that almost nobody accounted for a generation ago. Comparison used to be limited to the people physically around you. Now it is unlimited, curated, and constant. A man can spend 30 seconds scrolling and see an endless parade of other men who appear wealthier, more chiseled, more charismatic, more everything. And his brain, which was never built to process comparison at this scale, quietly absorbs the message that he is falling behind in some invisible competition. This bleeds directly into relationships. He starts wondering if she is comparing him to men online the same way he is comparing himself to them. He starts interpreting a like on a stranger's photo as a threat instead of the meaningless digital noise that it almost always is. None of this comes from her behavior. It comes from a nervous system marinating in curated comparison all day and then projecting that anxiety onto the one relationship in front of him. Recognizing this pattern for what it is, algorithmic noise, not a referendum on your worth, is itself part of building the philosophical foundation we talked about earlier. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that the world is full of people who seek praise, but that true worth is not found in the opinion of others. He wrote that a man should be content with his own soul, and that the soul is dyed with the color of its thoughts. When your thoughts are colored by comparison and insecurity, your soul reflects that. When they are colored by self-respect and clarity, your soul reflects that instead. Let us talk about what this actually looks like in practice, because philosophy without application is just entertainment. Picture the moment when she starts to pull away. Maybe she is going through something and needs space. Maybe the relationship is naturally cycling through a quieter phase, the way every relationship eventually does. The man whose confidence is borrowed reads this as an emergency. He increases contact. He asks if everything is okay 4 times in 2 days. He replays every recent interaction, searching for the mistake that must have caused this because in his mind, distance can only be explained by his own failure. This response almost always makes the distance worse because now she is not only dealing with whatever she was already dealing with, she is also managing his anxiety about it. The man with earned confidence experiences the exact same event completely differently. He notices the distance. He does not pretend it does not exist because pretending is its own form of anxiety in disguise. But he does not treat it as proof of his own inadequacy. He gives her room. He continues living his life, continuing working on the things he cares about, continuing seeing his friends, continuing functioning as a complete person. If she needs to talk about it, he is available and present without pressure. If she does not, he does not force the conversation before she is ready. This is not a strategy designed to manipulate her into missing him. It is simply the natural behavior of a man whose stability does not require her constant reassurance. And ironically, this is almost always the behavior that gives a relationship room to breathe and repair itself because nothing suffocates intimacy faster than pressure. Now, picture an argument. The insecure man has 2 default settings, and neither one works. The first is to attack, raising his voice, becoming defensive, trying to win the disagreement the way you win a fight because losing feels like losing a piece of himself. The second is to collapse, apologizing immediately, even when he does not agree, abandoning his own position just to end the discomfort because conflict itself feels like a threat to the relationship's survival. Both of these responses come from the same place. The argument feels dangerous because his identity is on the line, not just the disagreement. The man with a stable internal foundation experiences conflict as uncomfortable, but not existential. He can hold his own position clearly and calmly because disagreeing with her does not threaten his sense of who he is. He can also genuinely hear her perspective and change his mind when she is right because admitting a mistake does not threaten his sense of who he is either. Notice that both directions become available to him at the same time. He can stand firm or he can bend. And the deciding factor is what is actually true, not what feels emotionally safest in the moment. That flexibility paired with steadiness is one of the rarest qualities a partner can bring into a disagreement. And it is the direct result of not needing to win in order to feel secure. Now picture the situation almost every man dreads. Another man enters the picture somehow. A co-worker she mentions too often. An old friend who reappears. A stranger who leaves a comment. The insecure man's mind immediately constructs an entire narrative of comparison and threat. He starts monitoring, checking, asking pointed questions disguised as casual ones, and the jealousy leaks out even when he tries to hide it. This reaction does not come from love, even though it often gets mistaken for love. It comes from scarcity. It comes from believing that his value is one option among many being weighed against other options and that he might lose the comparison. A man with earned self-worth experiences this differently, not because he is naive or does not care, but because his sense of value is not up for a vote. He knows what he brings to the relationship because he built it deliberately through the competence and resilience and clarity we already talked about. Someone else existing in her life does not subtract from what he has built. This does not mean he tolerates genuine disrespect or boundaries that get overstepped. Boundaries still matter, and a man with real confidence enforces them clearly and without apology. But the enforcement comes from calm clarity about what he will and will not accept, not from panic about being replaced. There is a massive difference between the sentence, "This is not acceptable to me," spoken with steadiness, and the same sentence shouted through anxiety. Both might use identical words. Only one of them sounds like strength. And then there is the situation nobody warns you about because it does not look dramatic from the outside. Routine. The early excitement fades, as it always eventually does in every relationship on Earth, and what is left is ordinary daily life. This is where a lot of men quietly stop growing. They assume the hard work is finished once the relationship began, so they stop developing new skills, stop chasing new goals, stop becoming a more interesting version of themselves. Slowly, without any single dramatic moment, they become less magnetic than the man she originally fell for, not because they did anything wrong, but because they simply stopped moving forward while she kept evolving. The man with a real foundation treats his own growth as a permanent, ongoing project rather than a phase that ends once he secures a relationship. He keeps building competence in new areas. He keeps testing his resilience in ways he chooses rather than ways forced on him. He keeps refining his understanding of what he values and why. This is not about performing for her. It has nothing to do with trying to impress anyone. It is simply what a person does when he treats his own development as a lifelong responsibility rather than a task he completes and then abandons. The side effect, and it really is only a side effect, is that a woman living alongside a man who never stops becoming more capable, more grounded, and more interesting rarely experiences the relationship as stale because he never became stale himself. There is a fifth situation worth naming because it is the one people almost never talk about, and it might be the most revealing test of all. What happens when things are going well? Not in crisis, not in conflict, just an ordinary good evening, nothing threatening anything. Watch what an insecure man does in these calm moments. Because insecurity does not only show up during storms, it shows up as an inability to simply enjoy stillness. He fishes for reassurance even when nothing prompted it, asking if she is happy, if things are good, if she still feels the same way. Not because anything indicated otherwise, but because peace itself feels unfamiliar and slightly untrustworthy to a nervous system used to bracing for the next disruption. A man with real internal stability can sit inside an ordinary good moment without needing to interrogate it. He does not need the relationship to constantly prove itself in order to trust that it is fine. He simply lets good moments be good without turning them into an audit. This might be the clearest signal of all, more revealing than how a man behaves during an argument or a crisis. Because crises give everyone an excuse for heightened emotion. Calm gives no excuse. How a man occupies quiet, uneventful, ordinary time together tells you almost everything about whether his stability is real or performed. Performance is exhausting to maintain during silence because silence gives nothing to react to, nothing to manage, nothing to control. Real stability, on the other hand, rests easily in silence because it was never dependent on constant activity or reassurance to begin with. There is a neurological piece to all of this worth understanding because it explains why this approach works even when nobody involved is consciously thinking about psychology. Human beings across genders are wired to notice stability the same way they notice a steady heartbeat versus an irregular one. Predictable steadiness signals safety. Unpredictable emotional volatility signals danger, even when that volatility comes from love rather than hostility. A partner who is calm under pressure, secure without needing constant reassurance, and consistently themselves regardless of external circumstances registers on a deep, almost primal level as a safe place to lean. That safety is not boring. It is the exact opposite of boring because it creates the conditions where real intimacy, real vulnerability, and real trust can actually take root. Chaos might feel exciting for a while, the way a fire feels exciting up close. But nobody wants to build a permanent home next to something that might burn them without warning. I want to be honest about something most content in this space refuses to admit. None of this guarantees a relationship survives. There is no version of self-improvement, no philosophical foundation, no amount of earned competence that makes you immune to someone choosing to leave. People grow apart for 1,000 reasons that have nothing to do with how secure either person is. A woman can be with the most grounded, resilient, self-possessed man on earth and still decide the relationship is not right for her. And that would not make anything he built worthless. This is the part where the borrowed power framing usually gets twisted into something manipulative online, sold as a guaranteed method to make her stay, to make her chase, to make rejection impossible. That promise is a lie, and it is worth naming as one directly. The actual goal was never to make you unrejectable. The actual goal is to make you someone whose entire identity does not shatter even if rejection happens. That distinction changes everything. A man who built his confidence internally can go through a devastating breakup, grieve it fully and honestly, and still know exactly who he is on the other side of it. A man whose confidence was borrowed from the relationship loses himself entirely when it ends because there was no separate self left standing once the relationship was gone. One of these men recovers. The other one has to rebuild an identity from nothing, usually while also grieving. The difference between those two outcomes is decided long before the breakup ever happens. It is decided in all the quiet, unglamorous months where a man either did or did not do the work of building something inside himself that belonged to him alone. So how does someone actually start building this, practically starting today? It does not require abandoning the relationship or becoming cold and distant, and it does not require pretending you do not care about her opinion at all, because that would just be another performance. It starts with small, honest audits of your own life. Where are you currently outsourcing your sense of worth to her reactions instead of your own standards? Where have you gone quiet about an opinion just to avoid friction even when you actually believed something different? What skill have you been meaning to build for years but keep postponing? What discomfort have you been avoiding that if you walked through it would prove to yourself that you can handle more than you think you can? There is a practical exercise worth doing before you move on, and it takes less than 5 minutes, but it tends to expose something people spend years avoiding. Think back to the last time you felt genuinely rattled inside a relationship, any relationship, past or present. Not mildly annoyed, genuinely rattled. The kind of feeling that stayed with you for hours afterward. Now ask yourself honestly what that feeling was actually protecting. Underneath almost every one of these moments is a quiet, specific fear. And it is rarely the fear people say out loud. It is not usually, "I am afraid she will leave." It is closer to, "I am afraid that if she leaves, it will confirm something I already suspect about myself." That second sentence is the real one. That is the fracture doing the talking. And once you can name the actual fear instead of the surface reaction it produces, you finally have something concrete to work on instead of a vague, formless anxiety that shows up uninvited and ruins otherwise good days. This same audit works outside romantic relationships too, and it is worth widening the lens for a moment because borrowed confidence rarely limits itself to one area of life. The same man who needs constant reassurance from a partner often needs it from his career as well, chasing promotions and titles, not because the work itself is meaningful to him, but because the title functions as external proof that he matters. He often needs it from his social circle too, curating friendships and appearances to maintain an image rather than genuine connection, terrified of what happens to his identity if people saw the version of him that exists when nobody is performing. Once you notice this pattern in one area, you usually start noticing it everywhere because insecurity is rarely compartmentalized. It leaks. The upside of that leak is that fixing the root cause, this internal sense of earned, self-generated worth, tends to improve every one of these areas simultaneously, not just the relationship that first brought you here. Pick one of those questions, honestly answered, and start there. Not with all of them at once, because that guarantees burnout and abandonment within a week. Start with one uncomfortable conversation you have been avoiding inside or outside the relationship. Start with one skill you commit to actually mastering instead of dabbling in. Start with one boundary you have been meaning to hold and have not, and hold it the next time it comes up calmly, without drama, without needing her to validate that you were right to hold it. Every one of these small actions is a brick, No single brick builds the wall, but laid down consistently over months, they build something that a compliment or an insult from anyone else cannot touch because it was never theirs to give or take away in the first place. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus wrote that no great thing is created suddenly, and the kind of internal stability that makes a man genuinely attractive to the right woman is no exception. It is built through the accumulation of small choices, each one building on the last. Each time you choose honesty over comfort, you build it. Each time you choose growth over stagnation, you build it. Each time you choose self-respect over approval, you build it. And as you build it, it becomes part of who you are. It becomes part of your presence. And that presence is what draws others to you, not because you are trying to impress them, but because you have become someone worth knowing. If this way of thinking made sense to you, there is a lot more where this came from. And the next one goes even deeper into how these principles play out when things get genuinely difficult, not just in theory, but in the moments that actually test a person's character. Subscribe if you want to keep building this with me, and I will see you in the next one.